Hello, Daniil. Are you ready?
Yes, absolutely. If I have the right to share my screen, I will. By the way, maybe there are people in the waiting room for this call because there are too few people in the audience. Maybe it's because of that. Don't you think? But anyway. Mhm. So, excuse me, should I start and how much time do I have?
I think you have about a half on an hour for your talk and about 10 minutes for questions if you want.
Great, thank you. So, should I start already? Because I did not hear the announcements.
So we start our next session. Our speaker is Daniel Tiskin from the St. Petersburg St. Petersburg
Branch of the Higher School of Economics.
yeah, from High School of Economics and Daniel, you can use English or Russian, but
I guess we have members of the audience here who don't speak Russian, so I think I'm going to speak English in any case. So thank you. Then, so I'm going to present some data from Russian that have to do with a certain type of fictional context, namely what's known as counter-identity context. And so, to give you a short preview of what is going to follow, so there is this type of fictional context where you imagine or suppose that certain referring descriptions, certain referring expressions that in fact refer to different entities share a referent. So, for instance, in English, you can say, if I were you, I wouldn't go there. And so we have to imagine or suppose that somehow I and you are, in some sense, the same in those counterfactual situations. Now, Russian does also have a construction for that, although it's more towards the advice reading as opposed to the fully counterfactual reading. We will talk a bit about this distinction. So the example 2 is a case from Russian, and by the English translation, you can see that basically we once again can suppose that I, in some sense, occupy your place or your position or bear some of your properties. And in that counterfactual situation, I would ask for forgiveness the individual who is actually me and not counterfactually me. So you basically use the same pronoun or can use the same pronoun with different reference in such context. So I will report on a corpus study about Russian, and I will give certain quantitative data about how likely it is for different kinds of pronouns to refer to the real self or to the imaginary self in such contexts. And I will try to draw certain conclusions about the linguistic side of this issue, and also to a certain extent about what kind of information has to be available in the embedded context to this kind of phenomenal reference to go through. So formally speaking, this is part of a large project that we are doing in at the Institute of Linguistic Studies. The project itself is on evidential, meaning that my small part is more about modality and how referring expressions behave in those modal and counterfactual contexts. So, to introduce counteridentity. Counteridentity or counterfactual identity, this is the term that refers to different kinds of structures, including conditionals, but not necessarily, which make a contrary to fact supposition of identity. Or I think it would be more accurate to say that they actually make a contrary to fact supposition of the identical reference of certain referring expressions that do not, in fact, refer to the same thing. So once again, if I were you, there are actually more than one type of meaning that such structures can bear. So according to Kauf, for instance, in English, there are two types of such contexts. So in so-called imagined identity contexts, we indeed are invited to imagine that the two individuals are somehow merged into one. But another meaning is just a kind of advice where I place myself in your position, not in all respects, without sharing all properties, but just sharing a contextually relevant set of properties. And Russian has a construction exactly for that other type of meaning, which we can, following Kauf, call advice counteridentity, the same as the sentence 3 from French, à ta place, does not necessarily mean that I will, in that counterfactual context, be literally you. It probably means that I will share some salient set of properties with you as you currently are. And of course, such contexts are sort of modal. So they make reference to possible worlds which are different from the actual world. So this might happen because of the conditional itself, or maybe this happens because of a certain covert operator, depending on your favorite theory of how modality arises in the syntax. And in Russian, we don't have an overt modal, so probably it's some other kind of means by which modality modal meaning comes about here. But of course, in a modal context, there will be problems of transworld identification, cross-world identification of individuals. So who exactly counts as me and who exactly counts as you, and what licenses the use of the corresponding pronouns in those counterfactual contexts. Well, in many examples, you will find the first person singular pronoun, something like I and me, but not necessarily. So there are examples like 4 or 5, even in English, where we are making a counterfactual supposition about you or someone else, so the third person, and it's not even necessarily pronominal. So Elisa and Einstein are not pronominal in the example 5. So this is basically the range of phenomena that have been discussed under the heading of counteridentity. And it's also discussed that they share certain important properties with another kind of counterfactual context, namely with dream reports, such as the relatively famous example in 6. So in that kind of context, there are two selves, as it were. So one self is the locus of my perspective, the dreamer's self, and the other self is the bodily self, which in that particular dream would be the body of Brigitte Bardot. And so the similarities between counteridentity and dream reports are at least those. So both contexts are sort of exceptional with respect to the rules governing the distribution of reflexive and non-reflexive pronouns, what is called binding theory by linguists. So in a matrix clause in just as a separate sentence. I kissed me is not possible. You should say I kissed myself. However, in an embedded context, whether counteridentity or dream report, it's possible. So I can say something like I dreamt I kissed me, in the sense that I dreamt I was someone else, and that someone else kissed. And there are certain asymmetries between the different preference introduced in the conditional clause for both types of contexts. So, for instance, I can say, if I were you, I would get upstairs, but you cannot say, if I were you, you'd get upstairs. So this identification of me with you is actually asymmetrical. So we do not literally claim that I and you somehow merge into a single individual. What we are actually claiming is rather that I assume certain properties of yours, but you do not necessarily assume any properties of mine, let alone get merged with me. But there are also differences, at least according to one paper, and those differences have to do with how easy it is to construct those types of contexts with non-first person reference. So it is claimed by Gagan that you can say, if you were Brigitte Bardot, but you cannot say you dreamt you were Brigitte Bardot. I'm not sure if those judgments are clear, because they are at least not shared by all authors. Maybe we will be able to see that later. And there are several accounts of what happens in counter-identity contexts. So, for instance, Lakoff claims that we must distinguish between what he calls the subject, that is the locus of the perspective, the first person itself, and what he calls the self, that is the locus of body, but also of the public image or reputation, social network, and also of perceptions. So the subject is the one who perceives, but the perceptions themselves go into the realm of the self, which means that I can imagine myself having the perceptions that someone else actually has. And so, according to Lakoff, in the counterfactual worlds, the counterpart in the sense of Lewis of my subject, that is of the first person perspective, is the individual who is actually in the actual world your first person perspective. But the object pronoun, like if I were you, I would kiss me, something like that. The object pronoun me stands for the self, not for the subject. So you identify the subject, the locus of the first person perspective, but you do not need to identify the body. Korek's account capitalizes on the fact that Eve here is asymmetrical, but on the other hand, it is not the normal predication of is. So his argument would be that you cannot say something like, if I were rich, clever, and you. So you is not a predicate. Therefore, according to him, to be or were here is not the normal be of predication. And so he tries to devise an account based on counterparts as well. But his idea is that the pronouns in the embedded clause, or rather the pronouns in the counterfactual context, better said, refer to different counterparts of the same thing. So he does not directly differentiate between the subject and the self. Rather, he says that there are different ways to establish the relations of counterparthood. And you can be my counterpart because you have the same body, or alternatively, you can be my counterpart because you have the same self. And he basically claims that those two pronouns after the conditional clause refer to different counterparts. Well, Cal does in a way a similar thing. So she does not recognize the complete symmetry of the copula of the word. But her analysis is influenced by what Perkus and Sauerland did for dream reports. And so basically her idea would be that in a sentence like, if I were you, I would kiss me, I, in the second clause, does not refer at all. Rather, it is a bound variable, which is bound by the model operator. That model operator transposes us into a context where I assume certain relevant properties of yours. That's why I subscript this model with something like I plus the set of properties typical of you. And so we have to consider those contexts where I have certain properties that you actually have. And those contexts are like centered worlds. And at those centered worlds, the center of the world, that is the locus of the first person perspective, say kisses the one who is actually me. So who is the individual where the first person perspective is at the actual world. So that's her way to arrive at the perceived truth conditions of such sentences. Now, against this background, what can we do using linguistic methods, essentially, using empirical corpus methods? So I did a corpus search in a really large web corpus, because those contexts, they're not completely rare, but they're not really frequent either. So you need a very large corpus to be able to extract a statistically reasonable number of such examples. And so that's what I did. And actually, that's the second time I'm doing something like that. I also did a similar piece of work several years ago, but it was based on different corpus, and it had different parameters of annotation. Actually, it wasn't as detailed as the present search because I did not really take all the relevant syntactic factors into account, and therefore I think the current study is better informed syntactically. And so I did certain calculations, and I think we can draw conclusions both about how reflexive, like myself, behave, and what kind of information has to be available in this embedded context, in this counterfactual context, to make sense of the pronouns. So what are the findings that I was able to make? So before we discuss them, certain caveats are important. So first of all, if something is absent from the corpus, it doesn't mean, unfortunately, that you cannot say that. And if something is present in the corpus, it does not necessarily mean that it's quite grammatical. Maybe the corpus contains errors or mistakes or examples produced by non-native speakers. But of course, if something is relatively frequent in the corpus, you might be certain that this is allowed in the language. But when we're talking about semantic inquiries based on corpora, there is an additional problem, because you cannot ask the author of the text what they meant. You have to rely either on your own linguistic intuition as a native speaker, and that's what I do, or you have to hire annotators who will be unbiased about the particular research goals that you have in mind, but they will be able to just basically provide the semantic facts for you. So that's what I did not do. So I relied on my native speaker competence, and of course, in certain cases, I was not able to annotate examples, and I just basically discarded them because they were ambiguous. They were not clear as to what was meant, but I was able to rely on a bit of left and right context, so I did not actually extract the clause itself. I extracted a small bit of text that had some previous context and some subsequent context, so that I could make sense of what exactly was meant. So a very large corpus that you can access yourself if you want. And I extracted all data from that corpus, which had the Russian analog of "if I were you." So I had to do a couple different queries because Russian has different word orders in this kind of construction. And I ended up with some 18,000 examples, of which the majority were actually noise. So I had to manually select those where we actually had a pronoun of interest that would refer either to me or to you, basically. So in a context like "if I were you." And now this is a graphical depiction of what I actually found, but don't be afraid, I have a table with numbers, which is more explanatory. So basically, this is a depiction of the proportions of many different types of examples. So the whole upper half has to do with something like me, and the lower half has to do with something like myself. So those are personal pronouns and those are reflexive pronouns. And we can have nominal personal pronouns like me, and we can have possessive personal pronouns like my, and we can have nominal reflexive pronouns like myself. And in Russian, unlike in English, we can also have a possessive reflexive pronoun, something like my own or your own. And so for each of those types, I found the proportion of pronouns referring either to the real self, like I would kiss me, meaning the real individual who is actually me, or I would kiss me in the sense of kissing the one who is like counterfactually me. So the bearer of the first person perspective in that counterfactual context. And so here is what I found for different types of pronouns. So for instance, here it can very clearly be seen that in the local context, so within the same clause, basically, something like I would kiss myself or I would kiss me, personal pronouns without the self part predominantly refer to the actual self. Something like I would kiss me basically means that I would kiss the actual individual who is me. Whereas reflexive pronouns, something like I would kiss myself, predominantly refer to the counterfactual bearer of the first person perspective. So I would kiss myself, like in English, normally means that I would kiss, well, basically the one who is me in the counterfactual context. Now, this is just a tendency for reflexive pronouns, though. So, first of all, we do find that first person is in a way special. So a corpus study cannot tell you that something is not possible, but it can tell you that something is predominant in the language. And in Russian, first person subjects like I would do something rather than you would do something are predominant in such context. Then reflexive pronouns indeed usually refer to the counterfactual self, or better said, to the merged self, to the self which consists of some features of the actual individual and some features that are actually borne by someone else. So, for instance, я бы на вашем месте такие опыты над собой не ставил. If I were you, I would not do such experiments on myself. Should probably mean that I would not experiment on my counterfactual self. But that's not always the case. There is a significant proportion of cases where a reflexive pronoun would actually refer to the real self. For instance, я бы на его месте тоже сильно на себя обиделась. I would also get offended by myself, means by what my actual self did in that chat, not what my counterfactual self would do in that chat. And even the possessive reflexive, which is not typically used in this function, was used in that function in one example. Я бы на их месте к своим детям тоже не стала приближаться. I, as a counterfactual self, would not approach the children who belong to me as an actual subject. So this is probably different from English, or at least from what is reported for English. So Russian reflexives can refer both to the counterfactual self and to the real self. What else did I find? Well, what I found was that personal pronouns can violate or apparently violate binding theory conditions, so they can occur in the same clause as their antecedent, like I would not believe me, but only if they refer to the real self. So here I is counterfactual, but me is actual. The only case where a personal pronoun refers to the counterfactual self is probably outdated because it belongs to Colloquium, who was a 19th century writer. So this is relatively antiquated by now. And normally, Russian personal pronouns are only capable of violating binding theory if they refer to the actual, to the real self, whereas the antecedent refers to the counterfactual self. So, in fact, binding theory works for Russian personal pronouns in a counter-identity context. Because in examples like 14, the two pronouns do not actually co-refer. They do not actually share a reference. So probably Karl is right that condition B should not be dropped. It's just that those two pronouns are not subject to this condition because they are not co-referential, and therefore they violate nothing by occurring in the same clause. On the other hand, I think that certain statements by Kokure, which were, by the way, made with respect to English, not with respect to Russian. So I'm not accusing him of being wrong about Russian because he was not aiming at a description of Russian. But I would like to point out that his claims do not extend to Russian, at least. In particular, he's probably wrong to claim that if two pronouns, or more generally two expressions, refer to the counterparts of the same entity, they should bear different indices. And that's not even because of counter-identity context. That's because his treatment of counter-identicals in that case basically contradicts a very successful attempt at the interpretation of certain Dere readings of pronouns by Chalo and Xavi. So they dealt with quantificational cases of Dere, where a pronoun bound by a quantifier can be interpreted Dere. And for that treatment, they needed to co-index expressions which referred to different counterparts. And therefore, if you follow Kokure and deny that this can happen, their analysis falls, and it's not clear what we should use instead of it. Moreover, Kokure is probably also wrong in that reflexives are completely dependent in their indices and in their reference on the antecedent, so on the pronoun to which they refer back. In Russian, we would see that sometimes the reflexive does not actually refer back to the pronoun because they actually stand for different selves. This stands for the counterfactual self, and this stands for the real self. So this has to be analyzed differently when we come up with an analysis. And there are also certain linguistic consequences of my findings. In particular, it vindicates theories on which the reflexive, which in Russian would be себя, is not an operator on predicates. So according to some linguists, the reflexive is basically an operator which takes, say, a binary relation and makes a unary relation out of it, or it takes a ternary relation and makes a binary relation by identifying two slots in this relation. But I think that my data show that reflexive can have its own reference. So it's not an operator on anything else. It's a referring expression whose reference is sometimes coordinated with the reference of something else, say the antecedent, but in counter-identity context, it can even be different from the reference of the antecedent. And also linguistically speaking, I think that some of my examples, and most importantly, this example, where we have the particle тоже, which makes us consider alternative denotations, alternative situations for who else, except for me, might be the subject. So this example, I think, shows pretty well that Russian reflexives, in this case, the possessive reflexive svoi, can be coreferential rather than bound, because in the alternative situations, we do not talk about whether other individuals would approach their own children. So not the situation where the reflexive co-varies with the choice of the antecedent, but we actually consider the situations where other individuals would or would not approach my children. Therefore, this reflexive does not co-vary with the change of the subject. And this is known as co-reference as opposed to binding in linguistics. And therefore, we conclude that at least by this metric, Russian reflexives can be either bound, as expected, or co-referential. And this actually resolves a certain debate that has been going on in the literature, because for Russian, a couple of people have suggested that this is not possible, that reflexives in Russian cannot be co-referential. And actually elsewhere in another paper of mine, I also show that they can be either co-referential or bound in a different kind of context. But the examples here provide additional evidence that Russian can have co-referential reflexive as well as bound ones. So to jump to the conclusion, I have shown that in Russian counter-identity context, the subject is typically the first person singular, so I. They do, just like in English, apparently violate condition B of the binding theory, but only if that pronoun violating that condition refers to the real self, not when it refers to the imaginary or counterfactual self. In contrast to English, Russian reflexives of both types, plain and possessive, can actually refer both to the counterfactual or merge and to the real self. And when they refer to the real self, they are actually counterfactual reflexive. What I don't know how to do is how to explain why a reflexive can be used if it does not refer to the same entity as its antecedent, because the whole binding theory stands on the premise that the reflexive should follow the reference of its antecedent. But as we know from the work on Dere, readings of edited reports, such problems are typically resolved by recourse to something like concept generators. So the work by Perkus and Sauerland, and by Charlo and Chavit, and actually by myself, suggests that something like concept generators would be needed. But I haven't yet traveled this path as regards counter-identity. So thank you for your attention, and I have some more time. I will be glad to answer.
Thank you, Daniel. Are there any questions? Maybe in Zoom? So I have one question. Daniel, have you ever considered iterated counter-identity cases? For example, if I were you, I would hate people who say that if they were me, they would do this or that.
In fact, I haven't. So, of course, this is a very routine thing to do, or relatively routine thing to do when you discuss Dere and the dicta. And that's what I did, actually, when I worked on Dere and the dicta. But for some reason, I did not do this. Well, one kind of indication for me would be that if you work with real data, they basically do not occur. So I had how many, like hundreds of examples after manually cleaning all the junk out. So there were hundreds of examples, and I cannot remember a single one of the form that you cited. So they're just too contrived to actually occur with any decent frequency in Russian texts. But what you could do would be to do an experiment, as linguists typically do. So you create such sentences and you make native speakers judge them, whether they can mean the particular thing. And that might be one direction to go. Although I must confess that that would be a difficult task even for native speakers. And so you might do that in particular to figure out whether intermediate readings are possible. So for instance, whether the pronoun in this doubly embedded context can refer to the self introduced in a singly or like in a singularly counterfactual context. And that's what people have done, I think, with the dictum and direct. But even there, experimental support is actually very, how to say, very thin. There is literally one or two experimental works on the range dictum in English, and maybe one or two in Russian because I made my students do that. And so on this kind of context, I'm afraid there is basically none. And even for corpus studies, I'm not sure if there are any for English, because for Russian, as far as I can tell, there are only mine. So I think that would be a good direction to go, but probably not even the first thing to do, because the first thing to do experimental will be to study this kind of context. So the simpler kind of counterfactual context, like these from the present talk. But quite right. This is one of the directions to go. Maybe we could make one of our students, either me or you, do that in the future.
Thank you. Any other questions? No questions. Thank you again, Daniel.